Hi, loyal listeners. Just a mea culpa about today's episode. When taping the show, I forgot to plug in the soundboard into the recorder. Yes, it's the equivalent of leaving the lens cap on those old cameras. While the quality of our shows can always be questioned, especially by us, we prided ourselves in always having good sound quality. Until today. As mentioned on the podcast, we are a bit stretched and stressed and really could not tape all of this over again. So I cleaned it up as much as possible, and I hope you all like it and are comforted by Matt's reaction to the recording problem, which was, well, at least it wasn't his fault. Enjoy. From high atop the first state here in our tax-free Delaware hometown, with its first ever finalist for the President of the United States of America, we are the Podcast Pediatricians.
I'm Matt Gotthold.
And I'm Rob Walter. All right, Matt, it's been over a month. I don't know about you, but I'm tired. I'm tired of COVID-19. I'm tired of the masks. I'm tired of the eye goggles. What about you?
Yeah, it's got to crawl back under the rock it came from. This has really been it's not just physically exhausting. It's like mentally exhausting because forever new things are presenting themselves as issues, right?
Right.
What if this happens? What if that happens? Yeah, it can be very confounding. And unfortunately, I was just talking to somebody this morning about this. There's not like there's been a national medical edict on any of this, right? I mean, it's not like, okay, here's the algorithm. I mean, they seem to be all over the place. Right?
Exactly. What are you doing? What are you guys doing?
Exactly.
And what feels good? It's just not how it should be. And I think we're both back up to almost normal numbers, especially because we're adding in the well visits that canceled in the spring, so we're fitting all those in for the school year. And I think we're both doing more in-person, less telemedicine, but still seeing a lot less sick kids. And that won't come back for a long time, not with social distancing and masks.
Yeah, so I think that when it comes down to how we feel about that, I mean, obviously we are physicians, so it's nice that people are not ill.
Exactly, nice having healthy kids.
It's a little dicey. We also have to keep the lights on, right?
Right. And as you said, even though we're seeing fewer patients today, it just feels a lot harder. There's so many questions, and we'll go over some of them today, but discussions about COVID-19. So at the end of the day, I'm just wiped. I'm wiped. I go home, and I've seen 5 or 6 kids less than my usual, and I feel like it's more.
Yeah, I actually have recently been kind of the opposite. I've been more invigorated, and I think it's because I have medical students and I have physician assistant students, and so it's like I'm back on performance stage now, boy. I mean, I really enjoy teaching, and I really enjoy having them with me.
So what medical school is allowing you
I think it's called
to teach
Acme
them?
out of North Jersey. Yeah,
the Giant Medical School is also a big.
That's right.
That's really cool.
I had forgotten how much I enjoy having young minds around to bounce ideas off of, and also to challenge, and also to be challenged by. Yeah,
right.
It really gives me a lot of it.
We have a new partner in the practice who's really great, and it's just kind of when she comes over and run something by me, like, what do you think? And I'm thinking like, I didn't even think of that. It's nice to act like, I thought of that too, even though I didn't. So,
isn't there an old adage, and I know this isn't.
If you can't do, teach.
Well, that's your adage. My adage is the best way to learn is to teach.
Right. And so, as we are waiting in a little bit with dread for a possible second surge as we get into the fall, we're also seeing the spiking, as we predicted, of anxiety and depression in our patients, in our parents, especially the middle school, high school, and college-age kids. And are you seeing that also?
Yeah, we are. The problem that we're having, and I suspect that most people are with their patients, is that already the people who are kind of in queue for the people who can counsel them, psychologists and social workers, etc., are using them more than they would routinely use them. So the newer episodes, the newer cases of children who are really struggling with this, we have a real paucity of resources for them.
And I understand that a lot of psychologists have gone to online, and it makes sense, but I do feel my patients tell me that, especially those first couple visits when you're trying to make that connection with a new therapist, doing it by Zoom is just not the same. It's just not the same as like being there and being able to kind of see non-facial expressions, body language. There's so many different things that go to it that you can't get in a Zoom visit. But it's tough, especially as we'll talk about those poor high school seniors, college to be, who got screwed coming and going. So, all right, Maddie, let's give our disclaimer right off.
Okay. We are sharing our own personal opinions on pediatric care. Always talk to your own pediatric caregiver about your child. Pediatric caregivers should always consult expert guidelines and consider their own community standards of care. The U.S. death toll is over 190,000, with over 6 million cases overall. And this week, the IHME, also known as the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington, predicted that numbers will rise to 410,000 by the year's end, with a best-case scenario of 288,000 and a worst-case scenario of 620,000 U.S. deaths.
And that's scary. That's scary.
This is in line with experts who predicted the cooler, less humid weather, combined with more time spent indoors, will increase cases in the fall and winter, which is about what happens with other respiratory viruses every year.
And about 500,000 of the total cases in the U.S. have been in children, disproportionately in Black, Hispanic, and kids living in poverty. But of all of those, there's only been a total of 103 children who have died, compared to 190,000 total. And that's even a lot less than we usually see with the flu, which usually kills about over 200 kids a year. And new data shows that even kids hospitalized for COVID are much less complicated and do better than kids who are hospitalized for the flu. So again, to be clear, this is way worse than the flu. This is a generational pandemic. But in the pediatric population, it is much, much less so.
Did you get any flu shots in, bud?
Yes, they just came in this last week. And the change this year, we're no longer using the smaller dose of 0.25 milliliters in children under 3. Now, everyone 6 months and older gets the same dose, 0.5 ml. Makes life a lot easier. Are you giving the nasal flu?
Nah, we're gonna pass on the nasal flu this year. Yeah, we're not sure that parents wanted us mucking around in their healthy child's nose during COVID days, if not absolutely necessary, which it seems to be from time to time now with the swabs. As we mentioned in the past, it's going to take a while for us to trust nasal flu vaccine to any great extent again, since its effectiveness was noted to be lower than the injectable over the last few years. A few years ago, last year they touted it to be as effective, I think, right?
Right.
But nonetheless.
Yeah, they got to get back our trust. And they're really trying.
Yeah,
that poor company's trying. They haven't really gotten there for us yet, I think. I love the fact that you said COVID days, because it's really kind of sticking. Do you want to sing the song? COVID days.
That's your thing. I agreed to a one-time only that episode.
So we're not offering the nasal either. But speaking of vaccines, it is amazing, we've talked about before, how this pandemic has emboldened the anti-vax movement. It seems to have gained strength. Either I'm noticing it more, or it really is that there are more people who are refusing the flu shot. And I've been explaining to families that if it's any year that you want to get the flu shot, it's this year, with the unpredictability of coronavirus intersecting with winter viruses and cold weather. But for many, it's still a flat refusal. Now, the state of Massachusetts a few weeks ago announced that they are requiring a flu shot for anybody over 6 months of age if the child is going to attend daycare, preschool, elementary school, middle school, or high school, or any colleges or universities in Massachusetts. So what do you think about that, Matty boy?
I don't know, Rob. I mean, at this point in particular, I fall on the side that favors those kinds of measures. If a family does not agree, then they need to find alternatives for their children. It's a matter of public health, and we've empowered elected officials to put the right people in the positions to make these determinations. And there's some hopeful news on the flu front. The influenza season in the southern hemisphere has been incredibly light this year. The number of cases have fallen dramatically. In many countries, the rate has fallen by over 99%.
Wow.
Quite impressive. This may bode well for us. Although we think of influenza as magically appearing here every fall and then fading away in the late winter or early spring, it actually never goes away. It simply travels from cold weather areas like the U.S. and Europe in the fall and the winter to the areas that are cold in the southern hemisphere like Australia and South America during our spring and the summer. The leading theory for the dramatic reduction in flu cases is that severely limited travel of humans due to the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted the travel plans of the flu as well, and that the wearing of masks and social distancing implemented also helped to dramatically decrease infection with flu. And if this trend continues into the fall and the winter here in the Northern Hemisphere, where we are, the feared Armageddon of flu plus COVID-19 may not happen at all. And also, other notorious viruses like RSV, as well as the routine cold viruses. What were they, Rob? What were we taught? There were over 250 viruses that just cause the common cold, something like that.
Including a few coronaviruses.
Including some coronaviruses. So as well as those viruses, may also be seen much less this year. This is only conjecture. It doesn't by any means translate into changing the recommendations that everyone needs a flu shot. Yet many ID experts feel that a possible decrease in overall upper respiratory viruses is a pretty good bet.
And as you know, Matthias, we both have been disappointed, to say the least, in the lack of national coordination and guidance in reference to COVID-19 pandemic since the beginning, especially when we consider that countries similar to the U.S. have suffered from significantly fewer cases and deaths per capita. Many of these countries have been able to reopen services and communities by instituting public policies that have minimized physical risks and financial strains for their citizens. That said, at least we both had the confidence that the CDC was trying to do the right thing, since it has scientifically astute scientists and doctors who take their responsibility to scientific truth and accuracy as a given.
Not.
Until last week. And it makes me angry to even have to say this. But the newest CDC guidelines in reference to COVID-19 have been changed, and now it states that healthy people who have been exposed to COVID-19 do not necessarily need a test as long as they don't have symptoms. That's a reversal from the previous advice that clearly recommended testing for all close contacts of infected individuals, regardless of whether they have symptoms. And it's frickin' nuts. 40% of pediatric cases can be asymptomatic, and 50% of the spread of someone with symptomatic COVID-19 occurs in the first few days of infection before they know they're infected.
Your face is turning red over there, man. Well, of course, testing contacts can better control this pandemic. It's like it was opposite day at the CDC.
It's opposite day.
Right? It does get confusing, though. And the public, and oftentimes we healthcare providers, get confused by this. If a person has had close contact with someone who tests positive, the exposed person is asked to quarantine for 14 days, regardless of any test result obtained on the exposed person. For example, Rob tests positive, I've hung around with Rob, the one time a month I do, without the proper precautions of masking and social distancing, and I have a test done that's negative. The recommendation is still that I quarantine for 14 days, for several reasons. First of all, the tests are not perfect. There's not 100% sensitivity, meaning that a negative test does not always mean the person does not have the virus. Exposure to someone who has been determined to have the virus by a positive test is a more important determinant than a negative test. Secondly, the timing of testing can be important. We know that the peak time to test an exposed person in a quarantine is somewhere between the 5th and 7th day, since the incubation period of this virus is 3 to 7 days. But the exposed person can still show signs and symptoms or get asymptomatic infection up to 14 days after exposure, which is twice the incubation period. You cannot test out of a quarantine if you have been exposed to a positive case. Say it again, Robbie.
You cannot test out of quarantine if you're exposed to a positive case. Now, exposure has been defined as greater than 15 minutes, less than 6 feet away, and not wearing a mask with someone who's infected. Now, again, it's hard for us. Sometimes we get scenarios. When do we say it's an exposure? If the soccer coach was positive and you were near him for a couple minutes, is that an exposure? Well, probably not, especially if you have masks on. That's why I think that the coaches certainly should wear masks when they're coaching, and maybe not exactly when they're running around, but every stoppage of play, people should put their mask on. We both continue to talk to families every day about that difference between the 10-day isolation recommendation and the 14-day quarantine. Isolation is indicated when a person has been diagnosed with COVID-19 or if they've presumed COVID-19 by symptoms without being tested. But really, anybody with symptoms should be tested. So when I talk to families, say, get tested. We're going to isolate, you really want to get tested. The 10 days of isolation is meant to begin on the first day a person has symptoms of the illness, not on the day they were tested. If a person with symptoms tests positive, they isolate for 10 days from the time they became symptomatic and at least 1 day fever-free, and they must be getting better at the end of isolation. All 3 criteria, at least 10 days, no fever for 24 hours, and feeling better, are what's recommended before you lift isolation. But if you're diagnosed and you have no symptoms when you're first diagnosed, then you just do the 10 days starting from when you were tested positive.
Now, quarantine is indicated when a person has been exposed to somebody who has then had a positive test, or is presumed to be positive shortly after the given interaction. So again, I'm hanging out with Rob.
Hanging out, singing.
Doing our thing, playing a little... No, we're not playing Broadway tunes this time, Rob. It's my turn. We'll talk about music a little later. I'm hanging out with Rob.
Playing some foosball,
All of that, yeah. Hanging out with Rob, and then he's found that to be positive a day or two later. I should quarantine for 14 days from the time that I last spent time with him if I was not appropriately wearing PPE. The second example would be if I were hanging out with Rob, which is unlikely twice in a month. If I were hanging out with Rob and a day or so later, Rob became sick with COVID-like symptoms, and he had spent time recently with somebody with a positive COVID test. So we can presume that Rob has COVID at this point. So he would be presumed to have COVID. I would then need to quarantine for 14 days from the last time I spent time with him, whether he ended up being tested or not.
But it would be ridiculous for me not to be tested, because if I tested negative, Matt doesn't have to quarantine. One thing about the scenarios you gave there is that it seems like in every scenario, I have COVID-19.
That's what happens when you let me edit your script. You write, I change.
But this doesn't make any sense that I get the COVID-19. I mean, you eat bacon sandwiches. We've established that. So I don't see why I would get COVID-19.
Hey, you want to arm wrestle? Come on, get over it. Arm wrestle.
Where were we?
Let's get back to it. All right. But we agree the whole testing discussion can be a complex mess, and it's challenging enough for those of us who are in the midst of it, let alone for the general public. So again, why might it be helpful to test someone if they have to quarantine after contact with a person who is positive for COVID if they have to quarantine for 14 days anyway? Well, with a true exposure, it can make sense to get tested, no matter what the CDC's new guidelines say, in order to help with contact tracing and to help to evaluate the risk to other people in that exposed person's bubble, which is often grandparents and other high-risk people.
And for us, it's grandparents.
Yes.
For pediatrics, it's grandparents. We gotta protect the grandparents. Now, another type of quarantine is a post-travel quarantine, like what New York State and New Jersey and Connecticut did a short time ago. In this instance, those states designated many of the other states as being higher risk, including the pristine and vibrant state of Delaware. And this was partly due, I don't know if you knew this, that Delaware mistakenly did not update their numbers for weeks online, so it caused our state to be listed on the do not travel to for New York City, and so many people canceled their Rehoboth Beach vacations because of that.
Keep those ne'er-do-wells out of our state.
Now, states considered to be high risk are those with a certain percentage of positive cases that were above the threshold, or where the overall case rate was above a certain level. The states imposing the quarantine from those other states, the ones that they considered high risk, required anyone from those high-risk states or their own people who were coming back from there to self-quarantine for 14 days. Now, if any of those people fell under the category of essential worker, they were supposed to get a COVID test done within 24 hours of returning, and if negative, they could do their essential work if they wore appropriate PPEs with careful monitoring of symptoms. And I do understand the rationale for this exception for healthcare workers and other jobs, but this is specifically for the travel quarantine, not for the kind of quarantine where you're exposed to someone. And I've heard some people say, including someone close to me who was deemed an essential worker, that quarantine rules no longer apply to them. And that's completely not true. If they're significantly exposed without PPEs to a proven positive case, I don't care what they're doing, including being a physician, they will have to quarantine and not work. And at least that's how I understand it. True quarantining, exposure to a real case, is completely different than the travel quarantine. Do you understand it that way?
Yeah, I didn't think any of your partners were that shady, man.
Not my partner.
Okay,
no, just somebody I know.
Then there's
Jason Hondashane.
You're killing me. That better get cut. Nope, this is my man. And then there's the topic of masks. The American Academy of Pediatrics finally said recently that they supported universal face coverings for every child over 2, and that it could be reasonable for young kids to practice mask wearing at home so that they could be more ready to wear masks at preschool and regular schools. However, the World Health Organization continues to recommend not to use masks under the age of 5. I'm not sure I agree with them. I've had kids in my practice who are 3, 4, even 2 who are very happy to wear the mask.
It's impressive.
Yeah, so I think the AP got it right on this one.
Me too.
Delaware recently revised our child mask policy to state that anyone in kindergarten or above should wear a mask when in public. So basically masks for 5-year-olds and above when in public, and masks for 2 to 4-year-olds is strongly encouraged. And I think we both agree with that, Rob.
I absolutely do. And now it's in my head, I want to say that I was only kidding about Jason, because I'm not going to cut it out, right, but I'm always only kidding. As we mentioned in our last episode, if we healthcare givers are in a room with someone who's not wearing or not properly wearing a mask, who later turns out a few days later to have had the virus, it can force us to have to quarantine unless we universally wear masks, including eye protection. Which goes to the fact that it's really maddening to me when I'm in the exam room with a family and parents and teens, and they just won't cover their noses with masks.
Just pull the mask over your nose.
Oh my God.
Don't people realize that the nose is connected to the airway? Golly. You know, like when the milk comes out of Rob's nose when he's laughing. Come on, it's all connected. That covering your mouth but not covering your nose doesn't really protect anybody. I understand when young children have difficulty, but not the teenagers and the adults. You try to gently and nicely keep reminding them to cover their noses, but it gets frustrating. I don't know, Rob, I see this mostly at the supermarket. Right? Mostly like somebody who's maybe in their 50s or 60s who just like lets it creep down.
Yeah, and they leave it there. I'm not even sure it creeped down. I think that's just the way they wear it.
That could be it.
And you said this, men of a certain age, and they're usually wearing Eagles jerseys. I'm sorry, I'm a big Eagles fan, but like they're all wearing Eagles jerseys, and it's all under their nose.
You may be right about that.
It's true.
Open season on tickets next year.
My other big bugaboo about masks is when people wear masks that have that valve in them. It's a one-way valve, which basically means that when they breathe in, they are largely protected, but when they exhale all of their germs and maybe virus particles, it's not filtered at all. They can come right out at you. So wearing that type of mask, if there's no specific medical reason like COPD, to me is like basically saying, screw everybody else. I call them the FU masks. Nice. And I've called out a few parents on this, not saying the FU mask, but understanding that they're not filtering out what they're breathing out. And most generally have no idea that's how it worked. They just thought it was a better fancy mask. And hopefully they won't keep using them. And that's why they are barred in schools. But there is one new theory about masks, which I just read yesterday that was cool, is that some people think masks can serve as kind of a crude immunization, where it can let only certain few viral particles in and rev up your immune system, almost like getting an immunization. So another reason to wear masks.
But what's the best mask? There was an article in Science Advances recently that looked at 14 different types of masks. N95 masks were the best. The 95 does stand for filtering 95% of droplets. They don't work well if the wearer has facial hair or wears it under their nose, and it's difficult for children to wear them correctly. They work best if they're professionally fitted, but for most of us, that's just not practical.
Right. I've heard people say that if you're wearing them right, it hurts.
The second best were surgical masks, especially in the 3-layered version, but it is felt that these should also be reserved for healthcare professionals, and we appreciate that from people. 3-layer cotton masks were the next best, and yes, 3 layers were better than 2 layers, which are better than 1 layer. Which is better than nothing. The worst were the masks made out of t-shirts or bandanas. I will admit, I tied a t-shirt around my face about 2 months ago when I went into Home Depot because I forgot a mask.
All right, it's better than nothing.
It was better than nothing, but barely. But another study showed that the new hybrid mask that uses 2 layers of 400 to 600 thread count cotton with silk, cotton, or flannel in the middle works almost as well as the N95s for small particles.
Nice.
you're a thread count kind of guy, dude. Like, what kind of thread counts do you like?
For my home sheets?
Yeah.
Oh my God, nothing less than 600. I'm not
I'm
not a Philistine.
Oh man, yeah.
So one other annoying thing, I've had several parents say to me that this whole pandemic will be over by November 4th. So okay, I don't care what your political stripe is, but the pandemic is real, and saying things like that is ridiculous and really kind of dangerous. The biggest topic of conversation, which we touched on last time, in the office by far is about whether or not to send your kids to daycare, preschool, elementary school, middle school, high school, college. And as we mentioned before, I wrote that op-ed article in the beginning of July that we must open Delaware schools, and then a few weeks later came a surge of cases, and a few weeks after that came studies showing that kids carry the virus at much higher levels than we thought, and that the percentage of COVID cases involving youth rose from 2% to 5% to 9%. So I was like, oh no.
Once again, proving the rule number 8 at the Godhold household. Whatever Rob says, do the opposite.
Do the opposite. Like, I'm like, oh my God, I was keeping my head low. Please no one notice that I did that. You know, if I wrote it again, I would probably soften my rhetoric a bit, but not change the basic premise that the risks of not going back are pretty huge, and kids still catch and transmit this virus less than adults, and they don't get as sick.
Yeah, let's look at what was making us really nervous in late July. In the 4 weeks following July 9th, there was a 90% increase in child cases of COVID-19, 179,970 new cases in children in the United States. There seems to be 2 reasons for this. First, there were many more children tested in July in order for them to qualify to go to summer camp or to daycare, many of which were still operating. The criteria for testing was really loosened for this. Since about 40% of kids with COVID-19 may be asymptomatic, we were certainly picking up a lot of those asymptomatic kids. Still, while we were testing more, it's still not the kind of targeted testing we seem to need on a mass scale like they do in South Korea. The second reason, in late May, the restrictions on quarantining in place and on keeping certain businesses closed were greatly loosened across the country. Given the usual time lag of about 4 weeks, predictably, the cases rose in July. Having said that, a higher number of children testing positive is certainly a concern.
Then there were the studies on increased viral load in children. In an article from the Journal of Pediatrics, August 19th, out of Massachusetts General, it was found that the nasopharyngeal viral load in children during the first 2 days of symptoms from COVID-19 were actually much higher than previously thought, and even higher than some of the sickest adults, even though children had mild or no symptoms. Yet we still know that kids seem to get symptomatic COVID infection less often than adults, and that younger kids have symptoms less often than older kids. In the British Medical Journal study this month, only 1% of severe cases were in children, and of these 1%, less than 1% died, a total of 6 children. And every one of those 6 had already a severe illness or an underlying health disorder. COVID is much less deadly for children than influenza. And that's why only 103 cases of deaths were reported so far of COVID. Other studies are conflicting as to whether asymptomatic COVID-positive kids are really the main source of spread, but many schools and daycares around the world have opened successfully without outbreaks.
So, we get back to our opinion of kids going back to school. There's just no pat answer. Families need to do what's best for them, and again, any decision they make will be right for them. Parents must look at the plans their child's school has in reference to social distancing and mask requirements. Also, how they can maximize outdoor teaching and activities and optimize safety and transportation issues. Also, what kind of ventilation the building has may be pertinent when the kids are indoors.
Absolutely, and I never thought we would go into a deep dive on building ventilation, but here we go. It's been clear that the virus mainly spreads through airborne transmission, not contact with surfaces, often in closed environments with air recirculation. In a study in JAMA Internal Medicine this month, they detailed 125 Buddhists in China who traveled 2.5 hours in 2 different heated buses to a worship event last January. Each bus recirculated the same air. In one bus, a person got sick with COVID-19 later that evening. so was likely maximally infectious while they were on the bus. Over a third of the people on that person's bus ended up positive for COVID-19, and no one in the other bus ended up positive at all. So 24 of the 67 passengers on the bus with the index patient got COVID-19, and it was regardless of whether they were sitting near or far from the index case. So it wasn't, the pattern wasn't in terms of proximity, it just randomly did different people on the bus. And again, none of the 60 people on the other bus got it. And they concluded that they must have gotten it from airborne transmission of recirculation of air in the bus. So when you're indoors, like in a school, like in a bus, you obviously should wear a mask. But the ventilation options to minimize airborne spread are either to bring in more fresh air, to filter the air already in, or both.
Yeah, and we've touched on this at the very beginning of our discussions on COVID. A lot of researchers, a lot of people who are experts in the field, like Mike Wasterholm out in Minnesota, have been, crying the need for us to be watchful of aerosolization all along. In the meantime, so many places have been focused on the fomites on surfaces, including, I think, New York City's spending like $200 million.
Wiping, right.
As opposed to being more careful with the air.
Right.
Aerosolization. So it's great if the building has an HVAC unit. Often those boxy rooftop units that draw air from the outside to the inside to heat and cool that inside. HVAC stands for heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. By the way, a very good career from what I understand.
Well, I was going to say, have you had patients that over the years that have gone into HVAC vocational programs in high school or after high school? It does seem to be great. And they also have plumbing and electrician training, and we need more of these because college is not for everyone.
It isn't. I think people are actually. I see the pendulum starting to turn. And a lot of my patients are really taking seriously the idea of having a trade. And,
right.
And we're going to always need trades because you sure don't know how to do it.
I don't. That's true.
A high quality HVAC system can replace the air circulating multiple times per hour with dampers open as much as possible to admit fresh air. The air filters are rated with a MERV, or minimum efficiency reporting value. It's optimal to have at least MERV 13 designed to remove 90% of particles and measure 1 micron or 1/1,000,000th of a meter. Unfortunately, older HVAC systems cannot handle a MERV 13. HEPA filters are good too. They all must be fitted well without leaks.
Now, do you know the system where your office is? Because we have the same landlord in one of your offices, your main office. And so I contacted them, and
I'd look it up so you'd look it up so I wouldn't have it.
They are installing MERV 13. I said, you got a MERV 13? And I was thinking, the guy said, how'd that guy know about that? So I think anybody out there who's in a building, you should talk to, if you have a landlord, if you own your building, you should kind of look at, especially the winter coming, you should be saying, okay, what kind of ventilation system we here?
Many older schools do not have HVAC units at all, so opening windows and doors for cross ventilation does help. To maximize this, you can put an outward box fan in one window and an inward facing one in the window on the other side of the room. If that's not possible, then maybe don't use those rooms at all. Standalone air cleaners in the room may emit ozone, so may do more harm than good. Getting outside if the weather's good makes sense with perhaps tents. Some of the schools stay outside when the temperature is under 90 degrees and go virtual if 90 degrees are over. We certainly have some schools in this area that are having their classes outside.
Right. I think as long as the weather holds out, you should be outside as much as possible. Certainly, the less kids in the room, the better. Plus, the child's age needs to be considered on some level also, because despite some studies showing that children may have higher levels of virus than we thought, it still seems that the younger ages are safer. A last but huge aspect that must be considered is, of course, the family's personal bubble. Do parents have jobs outside the home? Or if they had to quarantine because their child was ill or exposed, it would be a major burden. Can a parent assist the child if they're home doing online learning? It's such a huge advantage for some families who have a parent who's home, but many families don't. Having a parent right next to a child changes the experience of online schooling, making it more easy and effective. Parents also need to consider the community and what rates of infection are present, which can be a fluid, week-to-week situation.
And then there's the particular child. Do they have special needs? Do they really crave the socialization for many reasons that makes it particularly difficult for the child to be online? I know that for some of my patients, particularly those with ADHD, online schooling is torture.
I know, torture.
Hopefully, parents got to evaluate this a bit during the spring. And of course, there are other people in that child's bubble that may be at high risk. I do find most of the parents I speak to are more in favor of in-person learning than not, and sometimes the most conflicted are parents who are those who are teachers themselves. Some feel that it just doesn't make sense to do in-person learning at this point, and others feel the opposite, and neither is wrong.
And as mentioned last episode, many places, including and especially here in Delaware, already have a bit of a public school, private school gap. And that is becoming a gaping chasm, with private schools having more resources and space to do in-person learning, and also lots of resources to better do online learning. And these private schools also know that if they don't offer some in-person options, they may go out of business. And a lot of their teachers are also not unionized, which means they can more easily be told that they have to work under conditions stated, and that could be stressful for the teachers. So, my opinion, I think schools should offer at least some hybrid in-person experiences, if at all possible, while also offering a full online curriculum with an equal amount of live instruction. What do you think, Maddie?
Let me see here. So my primary concern in sending kids back to school is not about the kids. It's about their family members and loved ones who may be at high risk due to their age or underlying medical conditions to succumbing to the effects of the virus. Is there a grandparent or great-grandparent that needs to be considered in this decision? Do people at home have immune issues or chronic diseases? At this point, epidemiologically, there's no compelling reason to think, with very rare exception, that children are put into significant harm's way, even if they're exposed to and become ill from the virus. There is, of course, no way to anticipate the future effects of any physiologic exposure to any factor that hasn't been studied before. It just can't be known. But the bottom line I've been giving to my parents in my practice is this. If you think your child or children will potentially put others who you know are at high risk in peril, then keep them at home. If that's not the case, then there's not currently a compelling reason in my mind to keep them at home. But the bottom line is you need to do what you will have the least regret about moving forward. I'm very much of a have no regrets kind of guy that you can afford.
Right, and also, as we said at the very beginning, that the decision they make will be the right decision.
Absolutely.
Okay, it's the right decision for them.
Sides,
right.
Very much so. And it's also, as we keep coming back to, this is a very fluid situation. You know,
right.
Things can change on a week-to-week basis. What happens if there's a vaccine? Is that a game changer or not? As it pertains to sending kids to school, we'll just have to wait and see.
Right. And then there are the colleges and those recently graduated high school seniors who, as we said, got screwed coming and going, losing their senior year and graduation and starting college in limbo. As became clear, many schools, including the University of North Carolina, NC State, Notre Dame, opened in-person learning and then had to close in-person learning pretty quickly because of outbreaks. And one famous one at NYU, they evidently didn't have any good plan for food, and they weren't feeding the people who were in quarantine, and that was a PR disaster. They were giving meat to vegetarians. They were giving bacon to Muslim families and kosher families. It was quite a disaster. Now, some of the responsibility for reducing the risks has to go to these college kids, and some, yes, are just not getting it. But the thing about these college parties, it's not just that there's a lot of people there, but it's the fact that they get loud. And any party that gets loud, like in a bar, where you have to talk louder or shout, is like going to a concert or singing in a choir, and it becomes a super spreader event. The University of Arizona recently nipped a possible campus outbreak in the bud by testing the fecal wastewater of 20 buildings on campus that were housing students. And when one of the dorms tested positive in their fecal water, they then tested all 311 people in that dorm and identified 2 asymptomatic COVID positive students. And they quarantined those 2, and then they did contact tracing and found another 47 who they isolated or quarantined, and they probably prevented a big outbreak. So we're going to have a lot more poop-related news to come. But I thought that was pretty cool.
Well, this is where epidemiology really works.
Right.
I mean, you have a controlled population. I think a good number of at least the more forward-thinking colleges are doing this. They're checking the wastewater that are coming out of the dorms.
Using science.
Absolutely.
That's good.
Science. Yay, right. Science.
Yay. All right, we'll be right back.
Okay, and just a word about our sponsors. So Julie Ortiz and Triage for Pediatrics, they've been a tremendous boon to our practice in terms of after-hours support. You can contact Julie at phone number 214-450-5030. It's Julie Ortiz, and it's Triage for Pediatrics.
And also High Fives, the number 5S, by Jim Hansen, the Marine. His company will do everything for you in website development, PHP programming, systems administrations, and systems security. There's been a lot of ransomware attacks on a lot of businesses, including medical businesses, in the past just month. He's great, and I recommend him. His phone number is 877-483-1040. We are back. Another big discussion and another difficult challenge during these COVID days is deciding when to get a COVID-19 test on individual pediatric patients who are mildly sick. Now, symptoms of fever and cough are easy, and certainly the loss of taste and or smell is an easy reason to get a test. But as we said in previous episodes, some patients have symptoms in pediatrics of just some vomiting or diarrhea, abdominal pain, general achiness, headache, fatigue. I test most of these kids if they're significant. A recent study out of JAMA Ophthalmology reported also that over 20% of kids with COVID-19 had eye symptoms, usually bilateral, without much discharge. Have you seen that?
A little bit.
Yes. Are you? But I'm not testing like unilateral pink eye. Neither one of us are. But to me, the toughest call is in kids with the mild runny nose and congestion, but little cough, no fever. I am being much more aggressive about treating possible allergies with nasal steroids, the kids who have fall allergies, and perhaps one of the newer antihistamines. But Matt, are you testing for COVID-19 most kids who just have isolated congestion?
No, especially at this point in the year where ragweed is running rampant. There's still some other pollens around. A lot of what we see is really allergy related. Now those kids, frankly, I would probably rather see in the office so I can examine them and at least feel much better about letting their parents know that this really does seem to be allergy related. In fact, just yesterday I wrote a note to a daycare because they wanted documentation that the physician thought that this was allergy related, which I don't blame them for. But no, speaking of allergies and antihistamines, we both want to touch on at least a few non-coronavirus issues during these episodes, if for no other reason than to maintain our sanity. And for this, we will highlight a couple of recent topics covered in the excellent Question of the Week series by the American Board of Pediatrics, and they are especially timely now. The first is the life-threatening Acute Flaccid Myelitis, or AFM. This polio-like neurologic condition affects mostly children and is likely caused by enteroviruses, such as the D68 strain. The disease peaks every 2 years between August and November in the U.S. and has done this since 2014. Now here we are in 2020, in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic and on the cusp of a new flu season, and we will likely have another AFM peak because it's due, and this is scary. The average age of children with AFM is around 6 years old, but the range can be anywhere from 3 months to 21. These children have GI or respiratory symptoms a week or two prior to presenting with this acute flaccid paralysis. The paralysis is caused by lesions in the spinal cord in the cervical region, affects the arms, but it sometimes goes higher along the spinal cord and causes difficulty with swallowing, known as dysphagia. The CDC put out an AFM alert earlier this month notifying pediatricians and pediatric providers in emergency departments and in urgent care centers that we may need to quickly recognize the symptoms and immediately hospitalize these children. Timing is critical, especially if the spinal cord involvement moves toward causing respiratory failure. An MRI of the brain and spinal cord can distinguish AFM from other neurologic conditions. The MRI is often striking with anterior horn cell involvement, like that seen with polio. Robbo?
Yes, Maddie?
Robbo.
Uh-huh.
Do you know why Franklin Delano Roosevelt is on the dime?
That was quite a transition from AFM. Why he's on the dime? Well,
Perhaps it isn't.
I don't. I don't think he was going to displace. Let's see the other common coins: Lincoln, Jefferson, Washington, Ben Franklin. So you're not going to remove those.
Solid citizens.
All solid. Otherwise, no, I have no idea. Why is he on the dime?
Well, think about it. FDR was a polio victim, and he founded the charity for victims of polio and other paralyzing conditions, originally called the Georgia Warm Springs Foundation, named after the place he went to convalesce. In 1938, he renamed it the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. And then the celebrity singer Eddie Cantor jokingly urged Americans to donate dimes
Eddie Cantor
to the president's cause. At the height of the Depression, Americans sent more than 2.68 million dimes, do that math, Robbo, to the White House. The outpouring of dimes from around the country led to yet another new name for the charity, which was, say it, Robbie.
The March of Dimes.
The March of Dimes.
The March of Dimes. Ah.
In January 1946, less than a year after FDR died, the Treasury decided to honor him with his likeness on the coin he made famous.
I never knew that, but here's my follow-up. Who was on the dime coin before FDR, and what is Eddie Cantor best known for? Now, I know both of these, A, because I was that cool kid in elementary school who collected stamps and collected coins, right? The cool kid never would play with you because, ooh, he's got a stamp collection and a coin collection. And then secondly, any Jewish kid in New York with grandparents who spoke Yiddish knew Eddie Cantor. First of all, who was on the dime?
Let's go back to the part about you being a cool kid.
Who was on the dime? The easy answer, because the answer is always going to be Lady Liberty, because all coins originally had Lady Liberty, even the gold
Eddie
coins.
Cantor. I was actually going to say he was a country singer.
No, Eddie Cantor. So there's two songs that
Eddie
he's known
Cantor.
for. Wrong Eddie Cantor. This is like the 20s and the 30s. The first song, and you want me to sing them? Yes, I would. Okay, here we sing them. One is If You Knew Susie Like I Knew Susie, oh, what a gal. You know that song?
That was good.
Do you know that?
Yeah.
And the second is called Making Whoopee. Do you know that? Do you know Making Whoopee? Another bride, another groom, another
vague familiarity
sunny
with Making
honeymoon,
Whoopee.
another season, another reason for making whoopee.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's it.
Nice.
That's all I got. A second question of the week topic concerns diphenhydramine, also known as Benadryl, and I'm going to just keep calling it Benadryl. It was written by Jas Twa v. James A. Stockman III of racing car fame. Now, Benadryl has been used broadly since 1946, ever since FDR was first put on the dime. It's mostly used for allergic reactions and for seasonal allergies, and some use it as a sleeping aid. Benadryl and the related first-generation antihistamines are in almost all over-the-counter cold and cough preparations, like the NyQuil every college kid uses. There is another first-generation antihistamine, hydroxyzine, otherwise known as Atarax or Vistarol, that's also used in many sleep preparations for kids, but has not been recommended to use these under the age of 4 for about a decade. But we continue to use Benadryl, even though if it was newly developed now, it probably never would be approved because of its side effects and potential toxicity. Diphenhydramine or Benadryl can be toxic at high levels and even life-threatening with respiratory depression and coma. It can also increase the risk of heart rhythm abnormalities. But the most striking fact is that a typical dose of Benadryl, the normal dose, will create impairments in operating an automobile that are equivalent to a blood alcohol level of 0.1, which is higher than most drunk driving law limits. So think about it. Any of our patients who are driving on Benadryl, or colleagues or friends, it's the equivalent of them driving drunk. And that's not all. Studies in the UK show that students who use Benadryl for seasonal allergies are 70% more likely to drop a grade in achievement with significant school performance issues. There's little reason to use Benadryl because the newer second and third generation antihistamines, like Zyrtec, Claritin, Allegra, yes, you know the generic names, they're better and they last longer than Benadryl. But what most people don't realize is that they also start to work just as fast as Benadryl. Now, I know personally, I used to think, well, I'll use Benadryl because the onset's quicker, but actually it's not. And I know we usually initially tell people to use Benadryl for allergic reactions like food reactions or bug bite reactions, but studies show that, again, the newer ones work just as quickly and they last longer. So really, there's not really any good reasons to use Benadryl anymore. Some countries, like in Zambia, have Benadryl listed as a controlled substance. And Benadryl is the most commonly found drug in autopsies of U.S. civilian pilots who die in plane crashes. So again, makes me rethink my approach to Benadryl. What do you think, Matt?
Well, that sounds good in theory. I would really like to see the onset information only because I'm not familiar with it.
Well, listen to the question of the week. It's excellent, and they've got all the...
There's so many different articles coming out about COVID-19 that it gets dizzying, and we just want to touch base on a few of the more notable ones. Of course, we podcast pediatricians love history, and from the beginning we've been talking about the comparison of COVID-19 to the great flu pandemic of 1918 to 1919.
I love talking about the flu pandemic.
Love you, the flu
1819.
Pandemic. Yep. Well, if you've been watching You Ought to Know on WHYY TV with Shirley Min, who we love, you would have seen her episode recently highlighting the Mutter Museum in Philly. This museum is full of really fascinating medical oddities, and we plugged it way back on season 1.
Where we reminded people it's called the Mutter Museum.
Oh. Well, I'm from Philly, so I say Mutter.
Of course, I know.
Mutter, I say Wooder.
Water.
The Mutter Museum, was that right?
That was good.
Okay. Is opening its first new exhibition in 5 years, and it details the 1918 to 1919 flu pandemic in Philly. Philadelphia was known for the terrible decisions on social distancing it made back then, which greatly increased the death count. Also currently known for people who don't wear masks over their noses, apparently. It should be a fascinating exhibition that will really resonate at this point.
Ever hear the expression, I'm so Philly it hurts?
No.
It's like, I'm so
I
Philly,
grew up
I'm going to
outside of
die.
Philly,
Okay.
yeah. As we all know, over 50 million people died worldwide from the 1918 flu pandemic, including 675,000 here in the U.S. I know we've said many times that the current pandemic is not nearly as bad as that pandemic was, but scientists and historians examined the toll of COVID-19 in New York City from this spring, and it turns out that it wasn't all that different than the flu pandemic in New York City over 100 years ago.
Wow.
The death rates in the 2 months from March to May 2020 in New York City was 202 deaths per every 100,000 people, which was 4 times higher than the death rate over the same time of year during the 2017, 2018, and 2019 years. Now, back over 100 years ago in New York City during flu's peak 2 months in the fall of 1918, the death rate was 287 deaths per 100,000. Yes, the death rate this spring was 70% that of the rate back in 1918.
Wow.
Furthermore, the increase in the rate back in 1918 was only 3 times more than the usual death rate for that time of year. It was not a great time to be alive. Not the 4 times more as it was this last spring. The baseline death rate 100 years ago was much higher because there were many more things to die from, and there were no antibiotics and none of the other advances of modern medicine.
Right, I cut my foot on a board.
I'm dead.
And then I died.
That's right. And then I died. Yeah. I caught a cold and...
I died.
And so did my whole family. Still, at its peak in New York City in the spring of 2020, even with the use of ventilators and antibiotics, the death rate was not all that different than it was during the pandemic of 1918. Wow. That's something.
It is. It really is.
So now, the good, the bad, and the ugly of COVID-19. As reported in the New York Times in late August, the fatality rate, or percentage of those infected with the coronavirus who die, is falling in most states. Yes, part of the reason is that more young people are getting the virus, and their death rates are lower. And yes, we need to concentrate on things beyond mortality, since there may be longer-lasting effects on the heart, lungs, and brain, even if the patients don't die. But numbers show that it's likely that the experience doctors and other healthcare workers have gleaned from caring for these patients over the first few months, especially in places like New York City, has really helped doctors across the country better care for the sickest COVID patients. Seriously ill COVID-19 patients are getting remdesivir and dexamethasone early in the course of their illness, and hospitals are also using techniques like proning, where the patients lay prone, meaning on their stomachs, which helps these sick patients use more of their lung capacity. So lower fatality rates are good news. And the FDA just approved an emergency use authorization, or EUA, for limited use convalescent plasma for the sickest of COVID patients. I think we mentioned this as a possible treatment way back on our first COVID episode in mid-March.
We did. You did.
We did. We're a team.
Okay.
All right. A small, non-placebo-controlled, non-peer-reviewed Mayo Clinic study on convalescent plasma's effect was determined by the FDA to have shown a 35% reduction in mortality. But this statement needs to be interpreted appropriately. The convalescent plasma therapy actually reduced the mortality rate by 3 to 5%, subset of patients that were under 80 years old and not on a ventilator. Overall, there were no significant differences in death rates. So yes, it's good to have another option for clinicians, but this treatment is not a game changer by any means. And when the FDA and other groups publicly tout a new treatment with wildly misleading claims that they then had to walk back, it makes it impossible to get people to join a placebo-controlled study, since no one wants to take a chance on getting the placebo once the FDA claims that this was a game-changing type of therapy.
It also gets me mad. First the CDC, then the FDA. And we saw this happen with hydroxychloroquine too. So are both the CDC and FDA becoming less trustworthy? I have to say, yeah, they are a bit. And that's dangerous, since people will start to doubt things they say, which could make it especially onerous when we want to get a future COVID vaccine started for mass use. And it turns out there's a new chief doctor on the White House Coronavirus Task Force who is pushing the FDA for EUAs for treatments like plasma, and he questions the need for any widespread COVID testing, and he argues against the science of mask wearing, and he says children cannot pass on the novel coronavirus. So who is this doctor? Is he an esteemed infectious disease specialist or an epidemiologist? What would you say? No! He is Scott Atlas, a neuroradiologist who edited a textbook on the use of MRI for the head and spine.
Because that's pertinent.
And I was a radiology resident, and I met a lot of brilliant radiologists and a fair share of really weird ones, but nothing...
None of whom you would confer with an infectious disease topic.
Oh
right?
my God! During a pandemic.
And put him in charge!
Nice. I worry that unqualified docs like him will be pushing the FDA to use EUAs to rush a vaccine before phase 3 trials for safety are complete. Any appearance of rushing this for an election will add to vaccine hesitancy. And right now, new polls show that 1/4 of Americans say they will never get a COVID vaccine. And this is highest in Latino and Black respondents who are at higher risk. But some little good news, the 9 major biopharm companies who are making the vaccines for the world all said they would not seek FDA approval for the vaccine until all phase 3 trials have demonstrated safety and efficacy.
Okay, here's another bad. There have been scattered reports in the United States that a fair number of the millions of COVID-19 survivors have not been able to shake their symptoms. These symptoms range from fatigue to more serious respiratory and neurologic problems and are lingering for these people for months after the diagnosis. Some are calling these patients long haulers. New York City's Mount Sinai Hospital now has the first post-COVID infection treatment center established for this type of patient. In a study out of Italy, published in JAMA this month, 143 patients were studied who had recovered from symptomatic COVID-19, and 87% of them had at least one lingering symptom, the most notable being fatigue and trouble breathing.
87%.
87%.
Wow.
Indiana University researchers analyzed 1,100 responses to a poll about post-COVID-19 symptoms in the 81,000-member COVID survivor Facebook group. Okay, a Facebook group is maybe not the most reliable source, but that's a lot of patients, and more than half of the 1,100 who answered the poll reportedly had at least one of the 6 persistent symptoms, with once again fatigue and breathing symptoms being the most common. Also noted were other symptoms that are on the CDC COVID-19 symptom list, including muscle aches, body aches, and headaches. However, 2 other persistent symptoms not noted by the CDC were also included. These were decreased ability to exercise and difficulty concentrating or focusing. So, although pediatric cases have mostly been on the milder side, we have to keep a lookout for more subtle, unexpected long-term issues, particularly neurologic. Researchers in China have found that flushing toilets and urinals can release inhalable coronavirus particles into the air. Aerosolization, once again. Coronaviruses can be found in an infected person's urine and stool. The flushing of waste creates an upward flow of particles into the air that travel faster and fly farther than was previously thought. It has generally been overlooked when assessing risk that COVID-19 virus is in urine just like the virus was with smallpox and Zika. Many places are putting lids on the toilets in public restrooms to encourage users to put them down when they're flushed. So, wear your mask in public toilets and run away as soon as you flush. But please,
please flush. And so, in our office, I noticed that our main 2 toilets don't have a lid on top. How about yours? You never go in them. Yeah.
I don't use them.
So that's something to think of. And plus, we're talking about urine, but a big issue is also there can be the virus in the stool. And hold the pressers, a long-term listener of ours, none other than that ex-president of the American Board of Pediatrics and part-time race car driver, James A. Stockman III, also known as Jazz Trois, sent us an article a few days ago from the September 1st Annals of Internal Medicine detailing vertical transmission of COVID-19 by fecal aerosol transmission in a high-rise building in China, from bioaerosolization of fecal wastewater into the pipes adjoining the master bedrooms on floors directly above and below the index case, something that they also saw during the SARS outbreak of 2003. All of this highlights the importance of bathroom ventilation and minimizing gas leaks and good bathroom hygiene. So they said that if you flushed the toilet and you didn't have great ventilation of the piping and there were leaks, then if anybody else was on the grid of those pipes, even 10 floors above or a few floors below, if they were actually standing in the bathroom then with a toilet cover open, that they can get infected. And when they looked at the numbers, they thought that's how infection spread. Wow. So it was just being in the bathroom near the toilet when someone below or above you flushed the toilet with fecal virus, and that's scary. And of course, long-time listeners know that we podcast pediatricians are always interested in all things scatological.
Go poop.
See our Poopalooza episodes. And I did query Dr. Stockman if he thought that passing wind itself could theoretically be a risk if you had COVID-19, and he agreed that farts were aerosolized vapors of feces as well, which led us to the term COVID farts, but Dr. Stockman preferred the term SARS farts and wanted full credit for coining the term. So, by his request, forevermore, anybody using the term SARS farts or even COVID farts should always think of James A. Stockman III. Jazz Trois.
Not really the legacy I associate with him.
That's what he wanted, and that's what he got. So, Maddie, that's all I have for this. Anything else you want to say?
I'm going to say good night, Marcus Robertius.
Good night, Mateus. Stay safe. Podcast Pediatricians Productions. All rights reserved.